Alright guys, welcome back to another Carburetor Revive Drift Kart video. What the hell is that?
You're boring!
恐怖は敵であり、味方でもある。
Alright guys, rolling straight into part 4 of our drift kart assembly. So starting off with the battery tray, we'll move on to the pedals and then the engine. All the exciting things, let's get to it.
Let's make it happen.
Let's do all of the things.
Excellent.
Nice.
So to start this episode, we're going to fit the battery tray to our ProKart in front of us. In order to fit the battery tray, we're going to need 2 M6 by 18 millimeter long socket head, 2 M6 by 20 millimeter long countersunk socket head, 2 M6 by 30 millimeter long socket head, 6 M6 nylock nuts, and 6 6mm ID large OD flat washers. We're also going to need the 2 supplied large zip ties. And for this particular one, we've got the battery. Now the battery is not supplied in the kit. We'll have a talk about what battery would best suit your kart later on. Let's get this stuff fitted. To begin with, I want to place my 2 M6 by 18 millimeter long socket head through this hole and this hole from this side through, placing the washer and the nut on the back side. So let's get that happening. I place my washer on the back and nylock nut on afterwards. They're going to sit just like that. So let's get the others done.
So the reason that you can actually put the bolts, nuts and washers together like this is the back of the battery tray is actually slotted. So it just makes it easy when you put it on there. You can slide it down over the front of the bolts and makes it easy to do up without having to get in there and put it all together.
So we've got our 4 M6 bolts sitting through this front rail. The next thing we're going to do is Matt's going to use those 2 slots in the back of the battery tray to drop down over these 2 M6 by 30 millimeter long socket head bolts. So let's drop that in place.
Like so.
It's going to sit like such. The last thing we have to do to mount the battery tray is put our 2 countersunk M6 by 20 millimeter long bolts down from the top, and we're going to put our flat washers and nylock nuts on the bottom. Let's get that done up.
So Brett's just going to tighten up the front 2 bolts first and just lightly nip them up. If you just hold the front of the tray down and backwards just a little bit, just to locate it in the right spot. So we've fitted our battery tray to the front of our ProKart kit. It's important to note that the battery tray will accept obviously a bunch of different size batteries. The internal width of this battery tray is 152 millimeters wide by 90 millimeters deep, and you'll be able to fit a battery up to 150 millimeters tall, or even probably slightly taller, getting up towards the petrol tank here. You don't need a battery of that size. The SSB Powersports batteries that we currently use are 150 millimeters wide, 85 millimeters deep, and 96 millimeters tall. These are general, basic, everyday motorbike or road bike type battery size.
If you have chosen to use a non-electric start engine, you do not need to fit the battery tray, you do not need a battery.
Way cheaper.
Way cheaper.
Even the wiring loom that you'll need to purchase is about half the price. So again, if you've chosen the cheapest route and you're not fitting the electric start engine,
don't need.
Cheaper. So supplied in the kit is 2 large zip ties. These are going to be used to hold the battery that Matt is holding in place on our battery tray. So in the front of our battery tray, there's a slot, and in the rear of our battery tray, there is also another 2 slots. This will allow the zip tie to pass around the battery tray, up and over the battery, just to clamp and hold it in place. Also, it's worth noting that at the moment, Matt's holding the battery with both terminals pointing forward. It doesn't really matter which location you have the terminals in. They could be pointed forward. It makes them easier to get to, or if you want it to look neater and you spun the battery around in this location so the terminals are at the back, the battery will also fit fine and the wiring will also fit perfectly. Let's get the battery fitted.
Which way would you like to go, sir?
Terminals back, yep. I'm going to place my zip tie down through the front, underneath the battery tray, up through the rear. So we have one zip tie on, let's put the other one on.
Also, while Brett's doing that, guys, if you ever have a problem with your battery, you somehow crash it into something, wreck your battery, have to replace it, don't cut the zip ties. If you have to buy them in a pack, they are pretty expensive, being the bigger kind. Get a tiny flat blade screwdriver, you can actually pry the tab out and separate it, reuse the zip tie.
So we've fitted our battery, we've placed our zip ties around our battery and around our battery tray, being careful to place the zip tie through the slot in the back of the battery tray. Now that the battery's mounted, we're going to get on to fitting the clutch, brake and accelerator pedal. In order to fit the accelerator, brake and clutch pedal, we're going to need the following fasteners. So obviously all of these are supplied in the kit. While I'm pointing out the fasteners, Matt's going to unwrap the pedal kit. So you're going to need 3 M8 nylock nuts, 3 M8 by 65 millimeter long socket head bolts, the 3 heavy duty springs that are in the kit. We're also going to need an M8 by 25 socket head and another M8 nylock nut. This socket head and this nylock nut are used to join the brake master cylinder clevis to the brake master cylinder pedal. So Matt's laying out the pedals. Also supplied in the kit is the accelerator pedal, brake pedal and clutch pedal, and the grip tape to go on each of those pedals. It is worth noting that if you're going to use a semi-auto engine that doesn't have a clutch, obviously the clutch pedal is supplied, but you won't need to use it when you build up your particular kit. We're going to show this later on our BasicKart kit when we fit the pedals to it. Let's get to fitting these 3 pedals into our ProKart kit.
Now, because this is our ProKart, the pedal on the far left here is going to be our clutch pedal. When we're assembling the pedals, we have to do them in order from left to right. And the reason because of that is because these 2 brackets mounted next to each other, you have to put the bolt through the middle bracket in order to get to the far left one. So let's move on to that.
So we're going to fit the clutch pedal down in here. Matthew's going to hold that. And take my M8 by 65 millimeter long socket head bolt, placing it through the brake pedal bracket all the way through and into the pivot for that clutch pedal. Just keep it still. Take one of my nylock nuts, put it on the outside.
So our clutch pedal is fitted. We have our M8 by 65mm socket head bolt going through and our M8 nylock nut on the outside. At this point, we can hold the socket head bolt with an Allen key and tighten up our M8 nylock nut. I'm going to hold one end of my pivot bolt or my 65mm long socket head bolt with my long Allen key. 13mm spanner, I'm going to tighten up that nylock nut. So what I'm looking for here is I want to tighten up the pinch so tight so the pedal doesn't move. I'm then going to loosen it off slightly just to the point that this pedal will drop down under its own weight. So at the moment it's sitting up. If I loosen that off a little, it is now nice and free and it's ready to fit the return spring. Okay, I've grabbed one of the heavy duty return springs that are included in the kit. I'm going to fit it to the right hand side of this clutch pedal using the existing hole. I'm going to hook it through. I'm then going to swivel or pivot the other end. And then using a set of needle nose pliers, I'm going to hook that into the slot that is on the frame. So we have our clutch pedal fitted. It was loose enough. We fitted our heavy duty return spring. It's all working fine. We're now going to move on to fitting the brake pedal. Before we go fitting the brake pedal to the frame, we might just point out a couple of things that are going to be difficult to see once the pedal is fitted. So, what you will probably find hard to see, that we'll see with the other camera, is in the front of the frame, there's a tab that is bented up, just here. This tab that is bent up is to allow the return spring to hook onto. And then in the actual pedal, just here where my finger is, halfway up this front bottom edge, there's also another hole where the return spring is going to hook into. What I'm going to actually do in the case of the brake pedal, I'm going to hook the return spring through this hole, and I'm going to hook the return spring onto the tab in the frame and mount it with the pedal. One more thing that I should point out, the clevis that is on the end of the brake master cylinder hydraulics, or this master cylinder mount on the floor, can be wound in and out. We can adjust this later. It is by far easier to adjust it now. So if I take my pedal and I sit it down, lining up my top pivot hole with the bottom of the pedal forward against the stop, and I look at where my clevis is, the hole in my clevis should be lined up with the hole in my pedal. If it's not, it's by far easier to be able to lift out the pedal now before it's bolted in place, adjust that clevis a couple of turns, and then refit the pedal and check it. Again, this can be adjusted afterwards, but it's by far easier to adjust it now. I'm going to drop that down, have a look, line it up. It's on point. Let's get on with fitting the pedal. We're now ready to fit the brake pedal. We've adjusted the master cylinder clevis to sit roughly in the right place. I'm going to hook on my heavy duty return spring onto the hole supplied in the pedal, and we're going to sit this pedal in place. We've placed our M8 by 65mm long socket head through in the pedal, placing the M8 nylock nut on the outside now. And again, we're going to tighten this up till it's too tight and the pedal doesn't move, and then back it off just enough till the pedal moves nice and freely. Yeah, pedal's nice and stiff, back it off a little bit.
The next thing that we want to do is hook on the other end of that heavy duty return spring onto the tab on the floor. It's also worth noting that these heavy duty springs are under a lot of pressure, so take your time. You may find this difficult. Again, these springs are quite stiff and require a fair bit of force to locate them. Oh yeah! Heavy duty return spring is fitted. The pedal's moving nicely. The last thing that we want to do is we want to place that M8 by 25 millimeter long socket head bolt through the clevis in the brake master cylinder and through the bottom of the pedal. When we fit this, we need to be very careful that the master cylinder isn't being compressed at all and that there's a tiny bit of free play at the start of this, and we'll try and show that once we've fitted it. Placing our nylock nut on the other side of that 25 millimeter long socket head bolt is definitely rather fiddly.
If it is too difficult, just get your mate to do it. With this bolt also on the clevis, guys, you don't want to tighten the absolute crap out of it so it actually pinches that brake pedal, because when you push it, it'll actually bind up. You won't be able to use the pedal at all. So you still need to make sure that's free to push up and down. Only needs to be nipped up. Being a nylock nut, it won't come loose.
We've obviously fitted our clutch pedal with the return spring. We've fitted our brake pedal with the return spring, placing the clevis onto the bottom of the pedal. We've put the bolt through the bottom of the clevis and tightened it up. What you may or may not be able to see is our brake pedal height is not the same as our clutch pedal height. Now that's because the clevis at the moment is holding back on the pedal and is holding the pedal down slightly. So what we need to do is adjust the push rod on the pedal just enough till the front of the pedal is hitting against the stop. We're going to adjust that now.
Very close, that's pretty much it there.
Okay, so we've now adjusted our brake pedal down here at the clevis. We've adjusted that push rod forward so that our bottom of our brake pedal is touching the stop. We can now lock off the locking nut on that brake master cylinder push rod.
Do you have to say that? Actually, no, you don't have to, Dory.
It's worth also noting that when adjusting the push rod on the brake master cylinder, you don't want that push rod preloaded at all. So when we adjusted the clevis so that the brake pedal is now in line with the clutch pedal and it's touching the stop at the front, we also paid attention making sure that that push rod isn't being pushed in at all. If you adjust this so that that push rod is being pushed in slightly, it blocks off the intake port from the reservoir to the master cylinder. And what you're going to find over time is as you brake more and more and the brake pads wear, you're not going to end up with the full amount of fluid transfer from the master cylinder to the caliper, allowing the caliper to work. So don't over adjust the brake master cylinder push rod. It's now time to fit our accelerator pedal to our frame. It's worth noting at this point that if any of these pedals are hard to fit in place, a light file on this outside edge of the pedal in order to make it fit is a good idea. Some of these pedals are a little bit tight to fit just because of the powder coating and the zinc coating. So again, just a light file on that outside edge just to make it fit is sometimes necessary. Let's get to fitting the accelerator pedal to this ProKart frame. Yep, got it. With the pedal sitting in place, this time our M8 by 65 millimeter bolt is going to go from the outside here where the brake pedal is and through in the direction towards myself. So I'm going to fit it now. Once we get it sitting in the hole, it's necessary to
push down the return spring for the brake pedal just a little bit to get the bolt sitting nice and flat, and then you can push that bolt through. Okay, I've got the bolt going through. Let's push it all the way through to the other side and fit our M8 nylock nut to this outside. Okay, we're going to hold one side of our bolt with the Allen key and tighten up our M8 nylock nut. Yeah, it should be tight now. Again, we're going to tighten up this pedal till it just doesn't move, and then back it off slightly till it moves nice and freely. Done. We're going to take another one of the heavy duty return springs supplied in the kit, hooking it through the front hole, or the furthest most hole in the bottom of our accelerator pedal. We're going to hook it through, pull it around, and then hook it into the supplied slot on the frame. We've now got our 3 pedals fitted with the heavy duty return springs and our brake pedal attached to the brake master cylinder. The last thing that we've got is our 3 grip pads that we can stick onto our 3 pedals. Ta-da! Pew, 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 pew. Okay, so we've fitted our pedals, we've fitted the return spring, it's hooked up to our brake master cylinder, and we have our grip pads fitted to our pedals. It looks on point, they're nice and stiff. If we happen to push on these by hand at the moment, they feel pretty stiff, but when you go to ride the kart later, they're absolutely on point. They're nice and stiff, the pedals feel really good, and they return nice and snappily. We're now going to get on to fitting the engine to our kart, and at that point it's going to start looking pretty together. Let's do this.
All right guys, now we're moving on to the very exciting part of building our ProKart. We are now going to fit this Burnout Supplier 6000. Let's get it in there and start turning the wheels.
Let's fit this engine.
Let's do the engine fitting.
In order to fit the engine to either our BasicKart kit or our ProKart kit, you're going to need the following fasteners and pieces supplied in both kits. We're going to need 4 M8 by 40 millimeter long dome-headed socket head bolts, 4 machined engine mounts, 2 M8 by 35 millimeter long socket head bolts, and 2 M8 nylock nuts. Let's get this engine fitted. Before we get to fitting the engine, we might actually show how the engine is going to attach to the bottom of the frame. So one of our 4 M8 by 40 millimeter long dome-headed bolts, this bolt is going to go up through the engine plate, through one of our engine mounts, like such, and then it will go into the bottom of the engine. So obviously there's 4 bolts supplied in the kit, 4 engine mounts, and in the bottom of the engine we can see that there's 4 mounting bosses. We just had a look at where the 4 engine mounts are going to locate on the bottom of the engine. We should probably take a look at where they're going to actually come up through the frame. So if we look in this back engine plate, there is 4 slots. This is where our engine mounts are going to fit. So I'm going to sit the engine mounts in place and sit a bolt up through one, just so you can see how they're going to sit before we put the engine in. So take our 4 engine mounts. These are going to locate over the top of these slots, like this. And our 4 dome-headed bolts are going to come up from the bottom through the frame, through these mounts and into the bottom of the engine where we previously showed you. So I'll grab one of these and just show you. That's okay. If we have a look, that is basically how our engine mount is going to sit. Also, before we fit the engine, I might point out that we've previously fitted the chain to the rear axle. When we do go to fit the engine, one of the first things that we need to make sure that we hook on is the sprocket that's on the engine hooked into the chain before we start doing up our bottom mounts. If we put the engine in and we haven't put the chain onto the engine sprocket, it's near on impossible to do once the bolts have been started. Let's go, let's get this engine fitted. I pick the engine up and down. Pitch it like such. In. At this point, it's important to hook the chain on. Pick the engine up, move it towards me a bit. Okay, we've hooked the chain onto the engine. Now going to let the engine rest forward a bit, and I'm going to get those 4 aluminium engine mounts tucked in underneath the engine. Okay, let's get those engine mounts fitted. I'm going to put the most rearward ones in. Now obviously, due to how compact these karts are, these are slightly fiddly, but you just need to persist. Okay, take 2 of my dome-headed bolts and I'm going to locate them into my alloy engine mount and get them started in the bottom of the frame, bottom of the engine. So I've fitted the rear 2 most engine mounts and I've started the 2 dome-headed bolts through them. I'm now going to pick up the front of the engine and put in the front 2 engine mounts and get those 2 bolts started. We've now got the 4 aluminium engine mounts sitting between the engine and the frame, and we have our 4 M8 by 40mm long dome-headed socket head bolts up through the frame, through the engine mounts and into the bottom of the engine loosely. What I'm now going to do is nip them up and then I can tighten up these top tensioners. So we've now got the 4 dome-headed M8 bolts wound up from the bottom, through the frame, through the engine mount and into the bottom of the motor. We've nipped them up and then backed them off just enough that we could move or slide the motor. The last thing that we need to hook up before we start fiddling around with exactly how the motor is going to fit is the 2 tensioners on the top of the engine. So Matt's just going to take the weight at the front of the engine. I'm going to put these tensioners back and place the M8 by 35mm long socket head bolt through the tab in the frame, through the heim joint, out through the other side. Now I can wind my tensioner to adjust it so that the holes line up. I'm going to do the second one. So second tensioner, I'm going to flop over. Matt's going to take the weight of the engine and again winding the tensioner to get it to line up with the hole. At this point, with the 2 M8 by 35mm long socket head bolts sitting through the rear tabs, there's no longer a need to hold the front of the engine up. we're going to place the nylock nuts on these bolts and tighten them up. I've got my two tensioners attached to the tabs on the rear of my frame with the socket head bolts through those. We're now going to hold them and tighten them up.
These ones that Brett's doing also, you can actually do them up tight because the end of the heim joint is actually like a spherical bearing. So it's not like the pedals or anything. They don't bind up once they go tight. The center of it can actually stay still.
Now that we've tightened up the two bolts through our heim joints on the back of our engine tensioners, it's really important that we get the engine sitting in the right orientation. At the moment, it automatically wants to sit down at the front due to the weight in the carburetor and cylinder. So quite often what you're going to need to find is that you're going to need to lift up the front of the engine, adjust these tensioners at the top, and then maybe nip up a couple of the bolts underneath the frame that are going into the bottom of the engine. It's very, very important that we get the right amount of tension on the chain and that we get the engine sitting level. You can't take level off the top of the engine here. The only two places that are level on the engine or parallel to the rest of the frame are the four mounting bosses underneath, which are obviously hard to get to, and the intake flange here on the carburetor to head adapter. So this carburetor to head adapter, it needs to be level or parallel with the rest of the frame on the engine here. If that flange is parallel to this part of the frame, we know that the engine is sitting in the right orientation. Then we can tighten up our tensioners and our four engine mounts. Again, it's really, really, really important that you take your time and get this right. A pro tip or an easy way to adjust the engine without having to hold up the front, but yet be able to get the chain tight, is if you take a large flat-bladed screwdriver, put it down between the axle and the rear of the engine, we can apply pressure to the engine and help orientate it while we tighten up the bolts underneath. You may also notice that we've hung the rear of this cart off the back of the trolley. This is going to allow us to get underneath the engine to tighten up those four dome-headed bolts without the bench or the trolley getting in the way. So I'm going to place this down between the axle and the engine. I can put a little bit of tension on it, get Matthew to hold it. I'm then going to hop up underneath and just nip up the four engine mounts, and then we're going to have a look at the orientation that the engine's sitting in. So we're just going to nip up this four at the moment. Awesome. Let's go up and have a look at the top. We've nipped up the four bolts on the bottom. We adjusted the tension on the chain, so the chain now is a little bit firm. I want about the thickness of the chain movement up and down. So if I move the chain up and then all the way down, it should only move the thickness of the chain. So in this case, the chain's about 12 millimeters thick or close to ½ inch. So if I push it up and then push the chain down, it should only move in total between 12 millimeters or ½ inch. Absolutely no more than that. These chains are a good high quality chain. They're not going to stretch later on. So wherever we set the chain now, theoretically, that is the tension it's going to stay. So if I have a look at the moment, our chain is pretty tight. We're going to adjust our two tensioners and pull some tension onto these and loosen our chain up a little. For now, have a look at my chain. I can move it up and down. This is probably a little bit too much, so I'm just going to adjust those top tensioners by winding them out a little bit this time. Let's have another look at our chain. Again, up and down. This is probably closer to where we want it, just a little bit of movement up and down. Before I go tightening up the pinch bolts on our tensioners, we now want to have a look at this carburetor adapter to manifold and make sure that it is at the same angle to the rest of our frame. We're going to make sure that that's parallel or level to our frame here. So off camera, we've just played around with adjusting the upper tensioners on the engine and the 4 engine bolts on the bottom that come up underneath through the frame in order to get the engine in the right location. We want the chain again so it has a little bit of movement up and down, and we want it so that this carburetor adapter on the top of the engine is parallel with the top of the frame. Now, how we can tell that easily once we've got it sitting in the right location is take a steel rule, sit it on the top of the engine across that carburetor adapter, check that this steel rule is level with this part of the frame. It needs to be in line, level, parallel, however you want to say, not facing down, not facing up. Then we know that the engine is in the right location. This is important for 2 reasons. 1, when we go to fit the exhaust later, and 2, the sump plug is at the front of the engine, and if you have the engine sitting too far down at the front, it just puts the sump plug closer to the ground, and this could be a bad thing later on. So we've got our engine sitting in the right location. I've tightened the tensioners one at a time with the bolts on the bottom of the engine. I'm going to wind them out, Loctite them, and tighten them back up nice and tight. We've obviously tightened up our tensioners like we said. We just wound out the 4 bolts in the bottom of the engine one at a time. We've put plenty of Loctite on those and wound them back in. Of any of the bolts in either our ProKart or our BasicKart that are likely to vibrate loose, the 4 bolts that hold the bottom of the engine in, these bolts are the absolute most likely to vibrate or come loose. So we want plenty of Loctite on those bolts when we put them in, and we want them quite tight.
All right guys, now we've come to the end of this video. We have fitted the battery tray, the pedal assembly, the engine tensioners. We've set the tension on the chain. And now we're going to swap back to our BasicKart to show you the difference in the pedal assemblies. Let's do it.
Because our BasicKart has
a 125cc semi-automatic engine, no clutch.
no clutch.
No clutch.
BasicKart. We've just looked at the assembly of all the bits and pieces on our ProKart kit and the pedals that were fitted to it. We've just switched over to our BasicKart kit. On this one, it obviously is not going to need a clutch pedal, so we've fitted the brake pedal that would normally be fitted to the middle on the left-hand side, and it won't have a foot brake hydraulics because it is one of our BasicKart kits. If you want to fit the foot brake hydraulic, this can be fitted at a later date as an optional extra.
And that pretty much sums up this video. So now, see you soon.
See you soon.
Pew, pew, pew. Blame transition.
What are we looking forward to next video, Matthew?
We're going to be diving headfirst into the wiring and blowing everyone's minds and letting the smoke out. Keeping it in.
We're going to keep the smoke in the wiring.
He is. I can't do it.
Yeah. Wiring. Next video is going to be wiring, accelerator cable, and clutch cable.
You've got the accelerometer, you've got the stopperometer, and you've got the whopperometer.
The wop. This is Hollywood.
Thanks for the save.
So you can do that and fast forward. Yeah.
恐怖は敵であり味方でもある